Hotet mot allt det vi uppnått finns i maskinen. Om den blir tanke och inte en lydande part. Och för att handen inte ska störa doktrinen, till det beslutade bygget slipar den stenen med fart. Ingenstans hålls den i styr så vi någon gång fredas. Där i en avskild fabrik må den oljas och röras. Den tror sig veta hur livet skulle beredas. Lika beslutsamt ordnas, skapas, förstöras. Tillvaron är dock förtrollad ännu. På 100 ställen finns källorna kvar och flödena renar. De krafter som endast den ödmjuke vågar beundra. Ord söker fånga det outsägligas art. Alltid ny musik bygger av bävande stenar. Ett gudsägnat hus i det rum som var obrukbart.
All we have gained is threatened by the machine, for as long as it has a willful spirit and won't obey, to show the lovely lingering of master's hands no more, for its resolute building it cuts the stone in a stiffer way. Nowhere does it hold back, so we once break free, and it stays oiling itself in the quiet factory. It is life it wants to know and be involved, and orders and creates and destroys with equal resolve. But to us existence is still enchanted, still soars at 100 places, a play of purest force that no one touches who doesn't kneel and admire. Words still come softly to the unsayable, and the music, ever new, from trembling stones, builds in useless spaces its house of prayer. Rainer Maria Rilke, 1922. The eternal return, as one of the highest explanatory concepts of Aryan irrationalism, secretly states that there is no historical development, perhaps not even evolutionary change, just intermediate periods of circular confusion until things go back to the way they ought to be, again and again, forever and ever. Though superficially similar, this is not the noble way written down in Sanskrit by the Buddhas. It is not the compassionate womb of the Tathagata, but a bribe of violence. To be a thinking subject under such conditions, under such a societal order of existence, must surely have been tough. We have seen time and time again brilliant minds being forced to violently, by their own hand, bring things to a premature end, simply because the imperialist period reproduced for them unbearable living space. Where does one find oneself when one feels it impossible to simply go on living, if not in hell? Hell is certainly no place for thinking. There is only instinct. And we have seen how the Germanophile philosophers during the intellectual decline of the bourgeoisie, after the proletarian revolutions of 1848, proclaimed with ever more pathetic, desperate polemic a return to the primacy of instinct, when the blonde beast would finally rule the herd. The era of great politics and world domination was an ambitious downward spiral which would reach its lowest low during the 1940s. In Buddhism, hell is defined above all else by one instinct: hunger. A ghost-like ontology devoid of the way-seeking mind. But what does this hell of neo-traditional mythology look like? What did they envision in the engine's steam cloud of unknowing? Well, if the land of Teutonic factories has provided us with the philosophers in whose thinking we might discern its theoretical shape, it is to the Scandinavians' ombudsmen, the Nordic civil servants, we must now look for its practical form. It is of course no mere stroke of luck that the liberal world's favorite substitute to the communist hypothesis, the welfare states of Sweden, Finland, Norway and Denmark, were created and are ruled by some of the social democratic parties which have enjoyed the uninterrupted power of parliamentarian victories longer and more often than any other democratic parties in the world. And though you have all heard of the term welfare state, I wonder if you are as familiar with the one other major constituent of the formula which they, even on Wikipedia, state will achieve from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. I am talking, of course, about folkhemmet, the people's home of class collaboration, the mass total of individual, patriarchal building blocks which erects the experience of the welfare state. Granted, not many steps of deduction needs to be performed to understand that those who are not of the folkhem are in secular hell. Of course, the managerial class of the early 20th century did not refer to it as such. That would lay bare the Aryo-heroic mythology of it all. No, they referred to it administratively as the Bottenskikt, i.e. the bottom ground. This might sound like an occult inversion of Meister Eckhart's Seelengrund, ground of the soul, which refers in a figurative sense to a place in the human soul where, according to spiritual teachings, God or the divine is present and a union of divinity with the soul can come about. Which isn't too far off, for indeed in their legislative approach this is the inverse place of the true, good and just, where all the slag of not the soul but folkkroppen, der Volkskörper, the collective people's body, was accumulated. And to properly define those who dwell there, to account for them and punish them, a new conceptual apparatus was invented. Vagrants, zienare, tattare, or gypsy, the derogatory terms for the Romani people or travelers, lappar or rags, the old derogatory word for the Sami, Jews, criminals and the like. What do they have in common? These people asked themselves. As one historian of the Swedish system explained, quote, "They drift, and that's the worst thing, the hardest thing for the Swedish authorities. They move around and you can't demand taxes from them. They can't do military service. The priest can't interview them. They are outside and therefore outside the law, or outside the whole system. They cross borders all the time." End of quote. They cross the border and break the urban feng shui laws of a people which at the terminal endpoint of their false Indo-European logic can only define themselves as being non-nomadic. And we have seen how the upper class of the Arctic North have been obsessed, indeed made it into a national tradition that they hope will set the world straight for the architectural god to classify everything. And ironically, should we assume that this is a project of clear definitions, What do those of obsessive disorders love above all else if not catch-all terms, such as the bottom ground? Being of the bottom ground was criminalized most broadly through the fundamental vagrancy laws, which binds together the dichotomy of an idle bourgeoisie and a working proletariat, identifying and trying to hold accountable all ugly exceptions which fuck up the beauty of their statistical sacred geometry. In Swedish, lösdrivarlagen literally translates to loose drift law. Lösdrivarlagen in many ways an ultimate law which simply makes it illegal not to work or not to live in an earth-fast house. I have made a point about how such laws were essential to the creation of both proletarian subjectivity and the modernist repressive state apparatus. This is, for example, how the Pinkertons, which is today owned by a Swedish security firm, came to be in the US. When that nation of land-owning settlers got their own dynamic job market, as well as its own national proletariat after the Civil War. When this crime of loose drifting and the law against vagrancy was used against unions, guilds, workers' secret societies, those on strikes, etc. But today in this intro, dear listener, I would like to tell you about the one particular moralist approach to manifest the bottom ground as the antithesis to the people's home. Perhaps folkhemmets worst enemy, the so-called fallen women. Fallen women as a bourgeois, promiscuous scapegoat became popular during the Victorian era and most of the Romantic period. A generation before that, in his songs of innocence and of experience from the late 1700s, William Blake had already understood that the cause was not a lack of inherent morality, but the unequal power relations of the new industrial society which packaged sex as a commodity. Regulated prostitution was in Swedish called the sewer model. It was created by a French doctor and phrenologist called Alexander Jean-Baptiste Parent du Châtelet, and was exported to the rest of Europe and the French colonies. According to this model, prostitution was necessary to channel unhealthy urges in the man. It was like a sewer pipe that had to be installed so that the whole system would not clog and start to stink. Du Châtelet literally got this idea from taking samples of Paris' open dumps and sewers, studying the fumes. Men must be allowed to satisfy their needs, but at the same time they need to be protected from being contaminated by venereal disease. If the prostitutes did not follow the rules, they would be banned, just like a car that fails the roadworthiness test. They were sentenced to forced labor under the Vagrancy Act, and then the not-so-merry-go-round began. What I mean by that will soon become clear, though it took me most of the summer to piece it together, with the help of a senior researcher called Eva F. Dahlgren, who has been writing about working-class women for half a century, her grandfather having been a race biologist in the 30s and 40s. Her extensive archive digging is not very available in English, but to my German listeners, I'll have you know that the Paul Kammerer detective Klaus Taschwer highly recommends the German translations. This sewer logic is also present in recently leaked documents from the 1970s in which Korean and American officials were discussing the organization of the military prostitution complex in the East, which MacArthur, a generation earlier, willingly inherited from the Japanese fascists, with the statement that it would, among other things, quote, prevent pollution of the race, end of quote. Though the New York Times published such a story last year, it did not hint at this being race biological, contemporary, or global. Something even the Oxford University Press is willing to do in its Women's Journey to Empowerment book. A book which makes clear that this industrial humiliation, rape and murder is still taking place in the estimated 800 bases in approximately 70 countries, as well as smaller and confirmed and unconfirmed security cooperatives or quote-unquote lily pads. Not to mention the many murky treatises such as visiting forces agreements or status of forces agreements that enable the US military to enjoy rights in different countries, such as the Akyat Barko, literally climbing boat, Überlift call girls, the Navy officers rations out to its crew with the help of pimp lords on those ships which are not allowed to directly dock in the harbor. Though I was told about the My Lai in school, when 347 to 504 unarmed women, children and old men were slaughtered, and 20 women and girls as young as 10 were raped, one should not forget that of all the military officers from My Lai brought to trial, only one was convicted and served a 3-year prison sentence. For serial killing and serial rape. Getting back on topic, in Sweden towards the end of the extravagance of the Belle Epoque, up until the First Great Machine War, the major end-of-the-line institute of forced labor before the madhouses of no return was called Landskrona Citadel. Built in the mid-1500s and surrounded by 2 large sets of deep and broad moats, it is one of the most intact citadels in Northern Europe, probably because it has been used as a prison for more than 300 years. Impressive in terms of medieval architecture, but the real mechanisms of containment, the aforementioned not-so-merry-go-round, were slightly more complex. It worked like this. Upon release, the women were socially stigmatized, having been sentenced to forced labor at an institute reserved solely for prostitutes or fallen women. They could not find employment. The only way to avoid a new vagrancy sentence and further forced labor was to re-register as a prostitute. It was then considered that they had a profession, an approved way of making a living. This system was officially abolished in the 1920s, after which it took on a more obscure character, with longer and harder punishments coupled with a slightly different moral hypocrisy. Let's try to summarize some aspects of this logic, most of which you will recognize from the various episodes of this summer. Director Gülich of Landskrona wrote in the institution's board report in 1921, quote, "Those who do not want to work, who, quote-unquote, fail to earn an honest living, and who live like parasites on society must be removed, must be isolated to prevent moral contagion to other weak characters, and must be forced to work in an orderly manner, and by this labor pay the state something again of what the same spends on their own upbringing," end of quote. In 1924 it was suggested by forensic psychiatrist Olof Kindberg that the law of vagrancy be renamed to, quote, "Lagen om behandling av farliga samhällsparasiter," end of quote, i.e. the law on the treatment of dangerous social parasites. One day in the cold, dark autumn of 1924, 48-year-old Wilhelmina Jernberg arrives at Landskrona institution. She says to one of the assistants, quote, "Yes, you sit here and think so much about how to do it best. When you come out and want to become a proper person, as I must try to become for the sake of my old parents and my son." End of quote. The assistant takes notes and adds their own comment, quote, "And it sounds so good when she says it, but it's hard to really believe it when you meet her cunning little eyes." She is small with a slightly peculiar, pale fat face, a little frizzy, combed up former bangs. The whole little personality, round and plump, makes an important impression. She wants to appear worldly and wiser than everyone else and is convinced that she makes a very favorable impression. The point is now, if, after this release in March 1925, her cunning can help her to avoid being sent here several times. After all, she has maneuvered so skillfully that she has been able to remain at liberty from December 1903 until now in September 1924. So there are certain conditions suggesting that in future times she will succeed just as well in keeping herself away. The physiognomic observations of the assistant are also present in the pictures of the police archived records. When they were taken in the 1920s, it was a big deal to go to the photographer and expensive. Photos from that time usually show people who had prepared themselves carefully, with both hairstyle and clothes. Here it's the other way around. The women were photographed as they were, because according to science, according to physiognomy, the outside revealed the inside of a person. An untidy one meant a misfit inside, a bad character. That's why they haven't been allowed to comb their hair, button their blouse or cardigan properly. The vagrants were photographed when they were arrested by the police. They were given number plates on their chests, and then there was a flash of lightning. As ethnologist Rebecca Lennartsson writes in her doctorate, quote, "Prostituted women were associated with an uncivilized past that they, the functionaries, tried to eradicate. The animal and crude, vagrancy and disorder. She represented a lower species on the ladder of evolution, but at the same time symbolized the horror vision of modern society, where everything was for sale, where boundless laziness, indifference, and sin were rampant. The purpose of the photographs was not only to keep track of the women, to recognize them when they moved, crossed borders, and were ostracizing. They were also to be studied by scientists. An abnormal mental life was revealed by a disorganized appearance, as well as irregular facial features." End of quote. And if you didn't guess it already, this is how this intro will eventually connect to the topic of these last two episodes about the creation of the Race Biological Institute. For imagine the hysterical fear when it is revealed that it is the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan daughters of the Folkhem who become whores of the bottom ground, and it is the heroic sons of the Reich which cheats them, makes them sick, gets them drunk and hooked on drugs, and pays for the inheritable immorality. The Race Biological Institute was there to tumble the photographic evidence and tell a less complicated story of light and darkness. Remember, this isn't actually sociology, criminology, anthropology, or psychology as a science. It's the reproduction of bourgeois mythology. When they found brown-haired, brown eyes, Roma or Jewish-looking quote-unquote subjects, then those photographs went into the folders of racial types prone to prostitution. Furthermore, Socialstyrelsen, i.e. the National Board of Health and Welfare, made a report of the women at Landskrona during the mid-1920s. And though, as we will come to see, fully compatible with the racial types of the Race Biological Institute, they were more interested in psychological types. They could declare that 4/5 of the 934 female inmates at the forced labor institution in Landskrona in 1916 to 1924 were, quote-unquote, mentally abnormal. But it was not enough just to recognize this. The Royal National Board of Health and Welfare wanted a sorting, a classification. I will now read to you, dear listener, a long list of the various, quote-unquote, psychological types from the, quote, Social Communications, published by the Royal National Board of Health and Welfare, 1925, booklet 2-3. For clarification of the psyche of forced laborers and the features that characterize different groups of these individuals, it has been found appropriate to distinguish certain psychological types in the survey. This grouping has been very difficult to implement and could only be realized thanks to valuable assistance from the prison management and the vagrancy department in Stockholm. The different types of forced laborers. Heading topic. Turning first to 1, the demi-monde group. It is broadly characterized by a higher standard of behavior than the other groups. As a rule, these women belong to the younger age groups, but there are examples of demi-mondes over 35. Although this group represents a higher stratum of female forced laborers, it nevertheless contains very questionable elements, as it is clear from what follows that one must expect a fairly strong crime rate within this group. It is also known that some demi-mondes have focused on abnormal sexual behavior. One can divide this group into 3 subgroups, namely finer ladies, fancy dancing girls, and others. The large group of street girls, number 2, is more of an aggregate group, comprising individuals of fairly undifferentiated behavior. What these women have in common is really only that they practice professional fornication without otherwise showing any of the distinctive features which characterize the more special groups. There are among the women those who can also be said to be more or less criminal or mentally deficient, alcoholics or otherwise degenerate. But these characteristics have not manifested themselves in them to such a degree that it has been thought necessary to assign them to the corresponding groups of habitual thieves, etc., mentally abnormal, alcoholics, or mountain larks, all of whom are very restrictive. Now, Marcus adding a note here, if you think the bird metaphor is strange as a definitive psychological type, let me tell you that the bird metaphor is the most common of all, from what I have gathered. Going on with the text. Even within this group, in addition to ordinary street girls, one can distinguish housewives and dancing girls, who, however, in habits, behavior, and social intercourse are at a lower level than the demi-mondes. This group also includes the so-called brothel girls. The characteristic feature of the souteneur girls, number 3, is that they live with a male patron, the souteneur, whom they maintain through pampering. Since, as is well known, these supporters constitute a particularly dangerous element among the male parasites of society, this cohabitation is of fatal importance for the women's ways of life. The supporter, who is usually her lover or not too rarely, in 1/5 of cases, her husband, not only keeps the woman in the street, in 2 cases it has been alleged that the husband even drove the wife out into the open, but induces her to commit criminal offenses. he procures liquor for her to sell to customers, robbing them or limiting himself to assisting her in this endeavor, taking care of the stolen goods, extorting money from compromised persons, etc. Gangster girls, number 4, are characterized by early degeneracy and impudent behavior. They belong to the youngest age groups, often live in their parental home even if they have held some form of employment, usually in a factory. Number 5. Mountain larches have been used to describe a group of deeply degraded prostitutes, constituting the bottom ground of all categories. Notice here is that secular word for hell again, dear listeners. And funny that the Ministry of Health and Welfare would only choose to couple it with the psychological category carrying the name of a bird. What this means for Swedenborgian winged or unwinged, good or evil angels, I'll let you spend your own time discovering, preferably in your study rather than on the streets. Going on with the text. These have as a rule their dwellings in the alleys and outskirts of the larger towns or at the harbours, often without a home, and the clientele is generally made up of male riffraff. Women belonging to this category are found in all age groups. 2 different types can be distinguished, namely those who, because of severe psychological and environmental stress, belong to this category from the moment they enter the world of nightlife, and those who gradually decayed from an originally higher position under the dissolving influence of nightlife. Even the latter, however, are as a rule mentally deficient. The beggars, number 6, are generally also frail. Most of them are more mentally abnormal or severely alcoholic. Within this group, a distinction can be made between ordinary beggar women. Their behavior and living conditions differ little from those of the mountain larches, disguised beggars who carry on their begging under the pretense of petty trading with worthless stuff. One of these made a living by fortune-telling. And paupers sentenced to forced labor under the poor law because they are, due to their lack of discipline, not fit to be cared for in an institution. As demonstrated above, a significant proportion of this clientele is made up of mentally abnormal individuals. In some of these, the abnormality is so prominent that it has been felt that they should be grouped under the title of mentally highly abnormal, number 7. This group includes, among others, the imbecile, debilitated, infantile, insane, and hysterical individuals. The so-called brutal type has also been included, as well as women with nymphomaniacal disposition, as well as some strongly homosexual and other psychopathic individuals. As the preceding group constitutes a more specialized category, the high-degree alcoholics, number 8, are also to be taken as a highly specialized group. As emphasized above, alcohol abuse is very widespread among the female forced laborers. This group comprises a limited number of these, namely those in respect of whom alcohol abuse can be said to characterize their lives to an even greater extent than their lives of professional fornication, quite apart from whether alcohol has been aroused during the event of nightlife or not. Habitual thieves, blackmailers, etc. also constitute a specialized group, number 9, in that it includes only a part of those punished for offenses or known criminals, namely the most dangerous in terms of criminality. Within this group, a distinction can be made between general thieves, shoplifters, thieves as helpers, blackmailers and swindlers, and adventurers. The last 2 groups, pimps, number 10, and dealers, number 11, should not require need for any further explanation. End of the quote in its entirety. And you might complain now, dear listener, and say something like, but surely if these categories are classifications of anything, they are sociological or perhaps criminological categories. But we have already made clear in the last episode that in this hell, psychological categories, any other than normal, are always already inherently criminal insofar that they are a crime against the stock and bloodline of the people. And if they are sociological, think of what Galtonian problems such a suggestion might cause for the ministry. If the etiology points towards nurture rather than nature, surely the administrators of welfare, the organizers of the folkhem, are all to blame. We can at least assume as much, for the enemy is already defending themselves further down in the report. Quote, "In spite of the above-mentioned thinning out of the groups in question, it is nevertheless not possible to regard these individuals merely as victims of unfortunate circumstances. Even in the most unfortunate cases, there are signs that the decline was promoted by a lack of resilience. This indicates that the cases which might be called pure environmental cases, i.e. those in which the only external conditions of life, such as distress and illness, bad influence from the environment, abuse, etc., have given the antisocial direction to the person's life, are so rare that such cases are practically not to be reckoned with." End of quote. There you have it. Do not practically reckon with it, or there might be no time for fika. But recall now that this was written after regulated prostitution was abolished, so someone ought to be reckoning with it, and more to boot. For how else was the reproduction of unofficial prostitution maintained? I'm suggesting, of course, that conditions of physico-social nurturing was put into place by someone or some historical block. We get a first clue in the yearbook of Landskrona assistant Wisén, 1923-1924. Quote, "It is in freedom that these women are most in need of help. But before it can be given them, the laws and public opinion must be changed, before which very little can be done. They should not be branded for life until all other means and ways have been tried." End of quote. Branded for life. How does one become branded for life? Well, as soon as you left Landskrona, you were of course registered as having been there. And since everyone knew why one was sent there, the police of the women's home village would know from where you have returned, should you choose to give up life in the city. And as the police, together with priests in a small peasant village, are also propaganda ministers for law and order, secular and divine morality, and we know just how highly their contemporary ideology thinks of the Nordic farm life idyll, choosing to return thus becomes a social impossibility. The cities might create wealth by unchristian means, but the countryside stews Aryan subjects. Once back in the city with so many classifications and documents to fill out and stations to report to as to officially reassure your rehabilitation, the police will know where you register to live and where you register to work as to pay taxes. And time again, according to the researcher Eva F. Dahlgren, the police would recognize it as their duty to report to that place of work and that place of residence whom the employer and landlord now have a professional relationship with, which most often resulted in a discontinuation of that relationship, and subsequently, now homeless and unemployed, a continuation of the professional relationships of the unofficial system model of the sewer. That is to say, segregation to the slums and ghettos of prostitution. And then again, eventually forced labor at Landskrona, of industrial washing, drying and mangling the sheets for the state's biggest contractors, i.e. the police and the military. I hope the picture of the not-so-merry-go-round is by now starting to come into view. Should we approach it more theoretically, using some common concepts with a much less common history of ideas, we could begin to point out that this is a desperate practice of occult geomancy, designed to regulate the urban and the rural, the moral and immoral, public and the private, the political economy of the official and the unofficial. This feng shui has old roots in the early dynasties of class society. Once a method of city planning by hat-wearing bureaucrats who sought to hide the slums and the ghettos from the examining eyes of a touring emperor, whilst not eradicating them altogether, as to be able to see to the needs of his male court and be considered good hosts. Now, how that became interior design, I will never know. Marxist sociologist Henri Lefebvre, in his The Production of Space, describes a binary between absolute and abstract space. Space developed in accordance with nature and with the aim of serving both the spiritual and physical needs of communities, i.e. appropriated to support everyday life, can be considered an absolute space. In contrast, space that is dominated and produced by political, institutional, and economic elites for the purpose of economic exchange, as a homogenized and interchangeable commodity, can be considered an abstract space. According to Lefebvre, the history of space proceeds from nature to abstraction. That is to say, sacred and lived spaces are gradually replaced by private property and exchange relationships. Meaning shifts, as does the power to fix that meaning, as the domestication of space is no longer held by those who dwell, but rather by those who dominate for economic reasons, and who therefore seek to maximize the extraction of value. Now, of course, despite a social rehabilitation success rate of only 5%, which cynically means a reproductive success rate of abstract and absolute space of 95%, the police are not omnipotent or omniscient in their service to the architectural lord of this politico-economical sociology. They need to prioritize. And remember, beyond the moral, social, psychological, and criminal classifications, there was one last institute founded in 1922 of final categorization, which could pick and choose among the fallen birds or angels, who was of darkness and who was of light, an institute which had the immense scientific insight to distinguish between blonde and brown hair, blue and brown eyes. Might we suspect, then, that when the police sent their photos to them, the state's Race Biological Institute in turn sent back a copy of those which they had chosen to be racially exemplary of prostitution? Because after all, with them soon sterilized, there would no longer be any danger of race mixing. Practically speaking, according to the Germanic model, an Aryan win-win situation beyond all morality.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome to the Return of the Repressed. I'm very happy to sit down with you again. Me and Sebbe are back at it. We're coming up towards the finale. I think we could consider this somewhat of a finale. It would be the first part of the finale. So I'm hoping that everybody has been catching on to is that like Nordicism is getting popular towards the fin de siècle, towards the end of the Belle Epoque, right? Like after the first machine war, and it's popular. Like so far, we've covered the fascination among Americans, the fascination among the Britons, and the Germans. So everybody wants to be Nordics, and that obviously begs a certain trajectory of our investigation, and that is why we will now return to the far north. And we've split it up so that I will deal with Denmark in this episode and touch upon a few things regarding Finland and Norway as well. And then Sebbe is going to do the grand finale, hopefully 2 weeks from now, when we arrive back home in Sweden. But I don't know, Denmark, even the Scandinavian, falls into some kind of like a dark place. Like not too much is known about Denmark. So I prepared a little introduction tier list here. So just to bring you up to speed. But I don't know, Seb, do you want to say some summarizing words of where we have been and where we are right now? Or are we going to leave all big questions for the next episode?
I can touch a little bit upon it. So throughout this series, we've been seeing the rise of racial sciences, racial biology, anthropology, etc., like morphing throughout the ages. Our starting point was with Linné and his classification system of the animal and floral kingdom. He had his theory about like applying what he did to the animal kingdom also to the human species as a whole, talking about what we said with the different like races and hierarchies, like the Mongoloids, etc., and that took off at first. And when they had a lot of them just like tweaking and coming up with like expansion packs of this original quote unquote original theory of Linné, right? And we saw with like Boxhorn and all the others that it was always aligned with the interest of like the emerging national state, right? Like the modern states in Europe at the time.
Yeah, the modernist projects of like nation building, basically. Like, who are we? What does it mean to be a people?
Exactly, and both on the home front, like in Europe, talking about like which language is superior and which is the original language. Is it Dutch or is it maybe Danish? And also on the within the colonies, right? To give credence to this mass exploitation of slave labor within the colonies, and from there on out, it takes a life on its own, right? And you have all of these.
They're grasping for every single possible explanation, basically. Like, if it's not language, then it's like some sort of ethnicity. If it's not ethnicity, it's, far out angles of bone structures, or, skin color, or like made up ancestral, ritualistic mythological behavior, of which they can see folkloric trace. And it doesn't really, I think the fact that they are so broad and that they're looking for it in all possible ways is a pretty good indication of that they're not satisfied. Like they're not really finding the thing as such. Like they just
Yes.
keep on. And maybe that's also why we see all these tweakings, right? Because all of these sciences, they don't have like a parallel gradual development, right? Like we've been seeing how one might lead to another, and then continuing separately once a specific science has sort of broken off from it, which also leads to all of these infightings that we've also been talking about, that they just won't agree with each other, even though to us it seems like, but you're doing the exact same thing. Like, what's the difference between, comparative anatomy and physical anthropology, for example, if you're both looking at, craniums? Like,
and here we have the methodology that they use is because, like, of course they are they're not dialectic, right? Meaning that, like, at the best they can do is to use this comparative methodology to just have like different specimens and hold them against each other.
Yeah, like a semblance of being dynamic, but actually they are essentialists. Like we know that they have a hypothesis from the beginning, which they want to prove. It's not like this comparative stuff is there to sort of, baffle themselves with it or something.
Yes, and also with regards to, like, we see how they like lean towards the metaphysical, but sometimes like with the Sven Hedins and the Retzius, like they go to, like, they are materialist, but then like vulgar, because they're not being dialectic, right? So like just being like an archaeologist and just going and like digging up some urns or whatnot in the desert, like on the other side of the world where you don't know anything about the structure of the class society there, the cultural implications, etc. You're just like looking for, fragments of like an old made up people, basically, like looking for the Scythians or something like that. So even when they are being like materialist and like doing this work like in the field, and they still have this metaphysical foundation, right? About like the notion of the Aryan hypothesis, etc. And then, as you said, with like regards to Nordicism, we see that like the urheimat, the ancestral home, as it were, it moves closer and closer to Europe, right? It starts off with being like in Tibet or somewhere like far off, and then it goes to be India, Iran or Persia, and then it comes closer, and then like it winds up somewhere in the north.
And that has to be like a sort of, I mean, just a simple logic of sort of, it's the part of Europe that feels sort of the furthest away from everything else. Like it seems like it's in the corner of Europe, so it's going to be like the most pure, right? That like, oh, we hopefully nobody has arrived here. But we do know that, I don't know, like, since we're talking about Denmark, I did watch a Danish documentary about like sort of some haplogroup research of the Vikings, and they did find out that like, yeah, they are like basically a mix of all different kinds of people, like not only European but like further away as well, which shouldn't surprise anybody, because like if you know anything about the Vikings, is supposedly that they are so good at traveling long distances and pillaging and bringing back slaves back home. So of course they took young women and brought them back home because they thought they looked good, and it was like sort of systematic race mixing in one way. So of course they're going to be like a lot of mixing, but this doesn't concern these people who we're dealing with, obviously. Like they just want to create a story that sort of flies. I don't know, like that, like a good story. That's what they want.
Yeah, but I mean, it's always like this, we can see this. We haven't touched upon it in this series, but like with the history of like economics, right? And all of these theories about like, in the ancient times, you know, you have different clans, and then they have comparative advantages. So some of them become like good goldsmiths, or some of them become fishermen, and you know, this bullshit. Of course, it sounds like a fantasy game, because like, why would one clan just produce gold? You know, like they're dwarves or something. It's it's total bullshit. Like, of course, in the like nomads had to be like self-sufficient and stuff, and like trade, and it was like trade.
Not essential to their way of life.
Trade existed, but it was not essential, and you cannot build like a civilization upon trade, like starting from scratch. And it's the same.
I mean, this is the Smithian, like the Smithian worldview, basically, right?
Yeah, but
like
it's the same here as we were talking about, but, like this alleged races, you know, because of course, like you bring up the Vikings, but it's, if you look in the Philippines, or if you look in Africa, or you look in South America, like, of course, different people have always like moved. If there are like natural disasters, or like just exploring, you know, it was not just the Europeans. And with wars, slaves, but also like trade. It's not that all of history is warfare, right? So you would have this interchanging, but they cannot accept this, right? Because it would be too much of a nuance to understand history this way. And then their brain like goes kaput.
They start smoking.
Yeah.
No, but exactly. I mean, this is why. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that there is like this. This is more about creating a story, like, because this is the sort of the purpose of a mythology, and it's the desperation of the bourgeoisie. Like, because the bourgeoisie is, we've been talking about like the irrationalism and putting instinct above logic and everything. Like, this is, again, their desperation, because they don't want to deal with the real problem which their social formation has caused. Like, they don't want to deal with the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So they need to focus on something else. And if they don't focus, and then it doesn't matter, whatever they will focus on, and put that on the pedestal of like the objective movement of history in a particular direction, they will be dealing with something which isn't actually material. Like, that they would be dealing with something that, I mean, there might be some point to it, but it's going to be a secondary contradiction. And then they have to sort of, make it more sublime. They have to elevate it. They have to coat it in all of these, polemic and sort of poetry of like grand events of, great battles of these people, or the clash of civilizations, and all these secondary contradictions that they wish that history and the world was about.
If I would describe it in one word, it's just like that it's an emotion that this instills in me. It's just sad, you know. It's like people that and I don't want to bash too much on people like having hobbies. Of course, in this day and age, it's good if you have like a hobby, but it's somewhat of escapism, like it's fantasy football or something. It's like the reality is too much, so I just retreat into to my little
but for normal people, as long as it's a hobby, it's fine. But for these people, it's something that they're willing to go to war for, and they're willing to like restructure societies in the name and for the sake of whatever it is that they believe in.
Okay, so should we jump into it then?
Yeah. So today I think that this first episode is going to be interesting because so far, like, I said, it's maybe a corner of Europe, and that's why they're all interested in Nordicism. It's not as simple as that either. We're going to see a few key points. We're going to see a lot of repetition, a lot of patterns, Denmark isn't completely unique, but we're going to see a few things which they do, which are unique, which then the representatives of the rest of the white eugenic project, they're going to be able to sort of point towards Scandinavia and be like, oh, look how well they're doing it. And I don't know, Sebbe, if we want to elaborate this theory completely today, or I think we'll bring it home in the next episode, but we've been trying all summer to figure out, and we stated it in the first episode, like, what's the role of like the Scandinavians? Like, what's the role of our own people? And I think we've sort of come to the conclusion that we're like, I don't know, the useful idiots somehow. Like, we're being put on a pedestal by the Germans, the English, and the Americans.
Why? This is the question, to answer. Why? It's not like of course, the Danish and the Norwegians and the Swedish, etc. They are like proud, but it's like being put on the pedestal by like the Germans, like you said, or the Anglo-Saxons. And this is, if the Anglo-Saxons are doing anything, you should be skeptic, right?
Yeah.
Wenn das Laub zu fallen droht und die Welt im Wahn vergeht, wir tanzen auf dem Trümmerfeld und drehen uns immer vor. Ich treib davon im Morgenlicht. Ich treib davon, ich treib davon. Wir tanzen auf dem Trümmerfeld. Wenn die Welt im Wahn vergeht. Ich treib davon, ich treib davon, ich treib davon im Morgen.